Hi, welcome to the first part of this tutorial series about next-gen graphics within Unreal. So all you need is the engine, just version 4.26, which is the latest one for me, and then we're gonna launch it. And I'm just gonna go step by step. We're gonna do this really slow all together. Here we go. I'm just gonna go with the games template for now, as I think this is the most common one, and with third person, as I think it allows you to see a lot and you can still run around with your character. And we definitely want a blueprint template, because for the C++ one you're going to need Visual Studio. If I were to create an actual game, I would go with the C++ one, but blueprint is fine for now. Maximum quality, of course, because we're going for next gen. Same goes for ray tracing. I think it's a common misconception that ray tracing needs or requires an RTX card. You can just do it with your graphics card, and it should be running regardless, maybe not as smooth. We don't need the starter content, as we're going to add some Megascans assets later on, so that should be fine. And then I'm just going to call it next gen tutorial. Just bear with me. Here we go. And there's a few things we want to do before we do anything else. So the first one would be to just clean up the content directory. I really like to work with clean projects. And because we're in a level right now that has assets being used, we need to just quickly jump into an empty level. So file, a new level, empty level. And then we can create a new folder here. Example, content. And shift all of these assets into this folder, move here. And then we quickly clean up the redirectors. So right click, fix up redirectors on the content folder. And then we can also delete these two remnant folders here. And now we have a clean project structure. We can create another new folder and we call it next gen tutorial. Oh, sorry. There we go. And in that one, we can just now put all the content that we want for us. The next step that we're going to do is adjust the plugins that we're going to need in the future. And I already get a message here, manage plugins. If you do not have this message at the bottom right, you can go under edit and then plugins. And there is 3 plugins that we want to enable. The first one would be the water, to get the new water system that comes with 4.26. The second one would be landmass, which is required by the new water system to be enabled. Just hit yes. And the third one is the volumetrics, which has some useful tools that we can use for the volumetric clouds or the volumetric fog, like volume textures and things like that. It prompts you to restart. Don't do that now. We still have to adjust some settings and then we can restart after that. That's it for the plugin side, and then we go into edit project settings, and then under rendering is all the good shit that we want to get the highest fidelity of quality. And in here, the first thing that we want to enable is virtual textures. I'm just gonna basically enable everything that is kind of next gen, and then later on, we can still disable it if we are not going to use it. Not all of these are obviously required. And the virtual texture support, for example, allows you to blend meshes. You can see that here in an example, like, for example, between the terrain and meshes that are laying on top of the terrain. That's what the virtual textures are good for. And in the virtual textures, I think we don't need anything else there. Like light maps, I don't think we need that. And then the next one that we want to enable is the generate mesh distance fields. Mesh distance fields can be used for a variety of things. For example, as it states here, like the distance field ambient occlusion or distance field shadows, but also for some visual effects things like I have a small example here as well. So this is how the distance fields are going to look like in your level. And these are used to, for example, create a flow of water or create this foam around objects and things like that. So it's always useful to have these enabled. And there is another one in here right under the distance fields called generate landscape real-time GI data, which is what we want so that the landscape can benefit from real-time GI. And this is done by utilizing the distance fields as well. So we can tick that box now that we have enabled those. The next point is screen space global illumination. It says beta, but it's still in a good state. And a global illumination for me is the next gen feature. That's why also obviously with Unreal Engine 5 we have Lumen, the next gen version of global illumination, and this one is screen space based and is still better than nothing, honestly, and it looks quite good. And now that we have this enabled as well, we want debuffer decals. That's enabled by default. We could enable the global clip plane for the planar reflections, but it has a really high base cost, and I'm not sure if we are actually going to use planar reflections. If you will in your project and you want the perfect mirror-like reflections, then you can obviously enable this here. We're not going to do that for now. And I think there is one here on the post-processing. The custom depth stencil pass, I always enable it with the stencil so that in the post-process I can mask out certain objects in my scene with a stencil. If you don't want to do anything with post-processing, you can just leave it as default. And then there is one last thing that I want to enable, and that is, well, ray tracing is already enabled because we enabled it when we started the project. If you have not done that, you would need to enable it in here. And the last thing that I want is so that the sky atmosphere, the new sky atmosphere actor affects also the fog. Because we're going to do a lot with fog, this is definitely what we want, so that it takes the color of the sky atmosphere as well. Yes, I think that was it with all of these project settings, and I think we're good to go to restart. It's going to take a while. It's going to compile a lot of shaders and so on, so just hit the restart now button, and then I'm going to see you in the base scene setup, because for me this is not going to take long. Here we go, the engine is finally back up, and with all the shaders compiled, we can now start with the base scene setup. So what we want to do is create a new level, and we're going to use the time of day, as this already has nearly all the actors that we're going to need for our base scene setup. It looks okay by default, I think. We can clean this scene up a tiny bit, like we don't need the text render actors. The other one we can keep, I think. It's always nice to have a bit of an object in your scene to experiment with. And we can add 2 or 3 more cubes, just so that we can see what we're doing with changing some ray tracing settings or things like that. It's always useful to have objects in your scene where you can actually see how the changes affect it. And also we want to color one of these cubes in a different color. Right now, if you just go here on the little search icon, you can jump to the material, and then we're just going to create another material here. I already did that, but you can just duplicate that one and assign it to one of our cubes. And then we're just going to change the color to something blue, for example. Hit apply and save that, and that's it. Now we have a blue cube. Nice. Okay. And then let's organize the folder structure a tiny bit. Let's select all of our static meshes and not the sky dome, and right click on the move to create new folder, and we're going to call that environment. Always work clean and nicely organized, especially if you work on a project with multiple people. Let's create another new folder for all the other stuff, and let's call that atmosphere. Oh my god. There we go. Okay. One of the things that is missing from this, as you can see, is the fog. There is no fog actor in there at all. So let's add a fog actor. It's all under visual effects. Most of these atmospheric things are under visual effects. And there is 2 fog actors, the atmospheric fog and the exponential height fog. The atmospheric fog has been completely replaced basically by the sky atmosphere now. So we are only going to need the exponential height fog. As you instantly can see, the entire scene goes blue. And what we want to do to not have the entire scene blue, I'm just going to shift that in atmosphere. One of the things, if you hide the actor again, the fog actor, that I can show you right now is how the sky atmosphere actually works. So we have our directional light, which is basically our sun. And if you rotate the sun more downwards, I'm gonna untick this box here so I can smoothly rotate without stepping. So if you start rotating the sun more downwards and it goes like steeper on the horizon, then it will tint the entire sky in this orange color. And that is due to the light being scattered differently depending on the angle of the sun. And this light scattering is exactly what the sky atmosphere actor does. It physically, well, more or less accurately scatters the light. And for example, this orange tint here comes due to the fact that the blue light is being filtered out by the atmosphere. And this light filtering is, for example, here is the Rayleigh scattering. If you would change this Rayleigh scattering color to orange, the orange light would be filtered out and you will get a blue sky. Obviously not what we want, but you have a bit more art direction by changing all of these values. For example, the scattering scale makes it all look a bit more like Lord of the Rings Mordor or something. But let's leave all of these to default. That's all good because Epic kind of calibrated these to look natural. But we want to do is, if we enable the fog again, we can see that the fog is not being affected by this at all and just has this weird blue color. And if you remember, we enable this checkbox to actually have the fog being affected by this, but this only happens if we change the color to black. So we do that for the fog in scattering color, but we also need to do it for the directional in scattering color. And once we did that, you can see, ta-da, it looks really nice, like the fog is being affected by this. And it will look even nicer if we enable the volumetric fog in here, because then everything obviously will be a bit more thick, and that's what we're going to shape later on as well in our fog tutorial. And you can really see here the God rays from the clouds going into this volumetric fog. It looks beautiful. And it's all being affected by that sunlight. So if we rotate the sun upwards, we can see that the fog perfectly now as being affected by this sky atmosphere. And yeah, I mean, that was 5 minutes of work now, and it looks fantastic. I think it's really amazing what Epic, the tools that Epic gave us there. Yeah. Okay, so now that we have the fog actor in there as well, I think there is two more things that we need. One would be the terrain, which we can do right now, because we're going to need the terrain later on for the water. The terrain can be found under modes and then landscape. And it recognizes that we don't have one in there, so we can create a new one. We will need to tick the checkbox enable edit layers, because that is required for the water later on. And maybe we can change the size down to something a tiny bit smaller, because we are not going to need a massive terrain in here. Maybe even smaller. We can always adjust that later on if we need to, and then hit create. To get out of this terrain editing mode, just hit modes again and select, or shift F1. And there we go. We can shift the terrain into a new folder called terrain, or landscape maybe. Nice and clean. Okay, let's save our scene under the newly created NextGen tutorial folder, and I'm just going to call it map_NextGen tutorial. I'm also going to shift the terrain down to 0 so that it is not in the way of all these other actors that I already placed. And this is a nice base setup now. One thing that is missing before we end this section of the tutorial is a post-process volume. Right now it's taking the default values of the post-process volume, which is definitely not what we want. Like, we want full control over everything, and especially post-process. So we just drag a post-process volume into the scene. And first of all, we want to make it infinite so that it affects the entire scene and is a global post-process volume. And usually the very first thing that I do if I drag in a post-process volume is disable the exposure. I think the exposure always kind of does things that you don't want or is unexpected behavior, especially if we are setting a scene up, right? If we already would have the entire game, we could fiddle with the brightness of the exposure, but with a neutral scene, we don't want this at all. So let's just change the minimum and maximum brightness to 1 and the exposure compensation to 0. So first of all, what you're going to notice is that the entire scene will get super dark, but this is actually more accurate. So if we take a look at the directional light, it's right now set to 1 lux, which is nothing. Like a normal directional light, if you I've actually looked this up in the on Wikipedia, a normal lux value would be like between 1,000 and 100,000, right? Which is, it's a lot of difference, but definitely not 1. Like 1 is nothing. So I'm also not sure what Epic exactly did there with their lux values. They don't seem to be physically accurate, I think, or maybe they had something else in mind. But if you divide the values by 1,000, then you are getting closer to what natural light would be like. So if we, for example, put 10 in, which would be a normal day, we're getting more accurate values here. Like this looks closer to nature, and I think is a bit better than it was before. Okay, I think maybe we drag one more additional light in the scene, a point light, just in here, so that we have another light that kind of to show off some features like the ray tracing. And of course, later on, we're going to light the scene properly once we have the Megascans assets in there. I'm going to change this brightness to maybe 75 candelas, which is kind of like a normal light that you would have in a room. Maybe a bit brighter actually would be the normal one, but I think this is fine for now. And we can change it to movable as well. There we go. So as you might have noticed, because we are having ray tracing enabled right now, the entire scene is a bit slow. Like if this was the problem for you in the first place, you can show your FPS here if you click that little arrow here and then show FPS, and you will notice that the FPS are actually quite low. This is due to the fact that everything here is set to movable, obviously, like all the lights are being set to movable, and this is the slowest rendering. But it's also the one that we want if we want to create some next-gen graphics, because we want probably a dynamic sun that can change during runtime, and we want everything to update, so we're going to need that to be movable. So we cannot really change that, but we can change that the ray tracing is enabled or disabled. And that's what we are going to do as the last step for our basic scene setup, so that we can toggle the ray tracing on and off quite easily. I'm not having an RTX card, so for me the ray tracing is really bad if I want to have a scene with which I can work with smoothly. So yeah, let's do that now. And to do that, we're going to create a custom widget. Like these editor buttons here are all these editor widgets, and we're going to create one of those. So just right click in your content browser, and under editor utilities, you will find editor utility widget, which is exactly what it does. It's a widget that affects the editor. I'm just going to call this blueprint widget editor graphics. Maybe we can put some other graphic settings in there later on. Just open it up, and if you've never worked with UI, this is how the UI looks like. You have the designer tab on here, which is where you can create all your buttons and so on. And on the right side in the graph is all the logic that is behind this UI item. So first of all, what we want to do is create a horizontal box in this from these presets here. You're just going to drag it under canvas panel, because we want to, if we have multiple buttons, we want to just put them next to each other, which is what the horizontal box does. And then we're going to create another horizontal box, which is going to hold our first button content. And for our first, well, it's not a button, it's a checkbox, because we want to have it on or off, so we can use a checkbox. So if you Google, if you search for checkbox here, you can add the checkbox into the horizontal box. And we also want basically a description text for this checkbox, so we can just search for text and put a text also in the horizontal box. The text is quite massive right now, so I'm going to change that text to something a bit smaller. So if you click on the text, and then there's the you take the font option here, and then you can change the size to whatever, 14 maybe, something a bit more natural. The text is not really well aligned right now, so we can change that. If we go into the very first horizontal box, there is an option size to content, and that should align this a bit more like better. Okay, and then the text obviously we want to change to something that makes sense. So I'm going to change this to ray tracing. Yeah, and now we come to the logic part. This is already the setup for our first widget. So if we go on the checkbox and then all the way down, there is an event that we can add, and then hit the plus button. And now we get an event for if someone clicks or unclicks this checkbox. Let's branch here. Branch is basically an if statement in Blueprints, and we branch on this condition that is if it's checked or not. And what we want is execute a console command. And the console command that we're going to execute is the one that is going to turn on or off the ray tracing. And if we are not really sure what console command this is, there is a way of finding this out. I'm just quickly going to minimize this widget window here and show you how. So console commands can be done in the engine by, for example, under development tools. So if you go Window, Developer Tools, Output Log, the output log is then appearing here. At least for me it is. And in the output log you can see all the stuff that is going behind the curtain on in the engine. And this is really useful to have in general anyway. If you have an error or something, it will pop up here. But also you get this small console down here, which is really useful. And in the console, if you're not sure what to enter, which command to enter, for example, to disable the ray tracing, you can just type ray tracing, and it will give you all the commands that has to do with ray tracing, which is really, really useful if you're not quite sure what you're looking for, because also the documentation on these on the Epic from the Epic side online is really sparse, I would say. Of course, you kind of have to test out stuff, which command is kind of affecting what and so on, but it's quite useful. And I've already done this for the ray tracing, so I know that force all ray tracing effects is the one that we are searching for. So you can just click on it, and you get it pasted down here. And then if we hit enter, it will give us the value that it is being set to right now. So -1 is the one that it's being set to by default, and -1 means in this case that it's taking whichever value is in the post-process volume. So if we take a look at our post-process volume, under all the way down under rendering features, there's all the ray tracing stuff. And for example, if we go on the global illumination, we can see that the type right now is being set to disabled. So the global illumination ray tracing is disabled, and this -1 value of the ray tracing effects will then take that whichever we put in here. If we would put it to brute force, it would take that one in there. So that is the one that we definitely want, but to disable it, we have to set it to 0. So if we hit 0, you can instantly see the change going on in my scene, but also in my FPS, which have become much better. To get the last command, by the way, in this console command window, you can just press the up button on your keyboard and you will get the last command. Let's copy the one that I just entered, just with Ctrl-C, and go back to our widget. There it is. And we're going to paste this into the console command here. If we follow the logic strain, if the checkbox is checked and its ray tracing should be on, then we would need to set this not to 0, because that would be disabled. We would want this to be -1. If you would set this to 1, it would enable all ray tracing effects, regardless of whether or not we have it set in the post-process volume. I don't think this is what we want. We want full control over it. So let's set this to -1. And if this checkbox is false, we're gonna set this to 0 because we don't want any ray tracing going on. There we go. You can compile this widget now and save it, and then browse to it. If you hit the browse button here, it will jump directly to your widget. We can then close it, and if we right click now on our widget, we get this Run Editor Utility Widget button, and here it is, our own widget. We can snap this, drag this basically into the top half of the screen, and even adjust this a bit, how from the size and so on. And that's it basically. We can hit this checkbox. All the ray tracing will be enabled. You can see, for example, here on this sphere that this is the ray traced reflections I'm looking at. And if we untick this box, we have no ray tracing going on at all. It's super useful to have things like that, and you can do this for a lot of different quality settings or console commands that you usually would enter by hand. You can just create widgets for this, and it's really useful. Because we can work a lot smoother if we have ray tracing disabled, but we know that we can enable it anytime to get the highest quality, right? Okay, and that already concludes this first scene setup of our tutorial series, and we are good to go to jump into the next one, which would be an in-depth look into the ray tracing settings actually. And yeah, we are good to go. Thank you for watching this one, and see you in the next one.